Good morning or good afternoon. Happy International Women's Day to you all. My name is Nina Hachigian. I'm the Deputy Mayor of International Affairs for the City of Los Angeles. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you to Marcella and the Consul General of Ireland and Mexico for convening this conversation around such an important topic. Before I begin my remarks, let's just take a moment to hold the people, the women of Ukraine in our thoughts. War is never good for women. And that fact is related to our topic this morning. As we turn our focus to the experiences of women and girls today and throughout the month of March, we must face directly the growing concern of gender-based violence. We know that the effects of the pandemic have been harder on women. Now, with nearly 2 years of data, we can confirm what we feared. Quarantine, social isolation, and lockdown measures put in place to prevent the spread of the virus have exposed women and girls to higher rates of violence. High stress and confinement with potential perpetrators have exacerbated an already dire situation that more than 1 in 3 women face globally. Looking at this problem directly means that acknowledging that violence anywhere it affects us all. Violence threatens community ties and family structures. It can leave physical and psychological damage that impacts both victims and bystanders, often children, for years, decades to come. It also has a profound economic effect. According to UN Women, due in part to lost time and productivity, the cost of violence against women amounts to about $1.5 trillion globally every year. City leaders are uniquely positioned to respond to this epidemic. Working at closer proximity to our residents than any other level of government, local leaders act as employers, as service providers, innovators, and connectors. In each of these roles, we must prioritize the safety of our most vulnerable residents. We must use the tools we have to address the underlying causes of violence, to create safe public spaces, provide resources to help victims, survivors heal, and to remove the barriers preventing participation in public life. Los Angeles is a founding member of the City Hub and Network for Gender Equity, or CHANGE. CHANGE brings together global cities from across 5 continents to explore how local governments are mainstreaming gender in all of our operations to advance equity. While cities alone cannot eliminate sexism, violence, or discrimination, I believe that cities are drivers of real solutions that can be repeated and scaled globally. In Los Angeles, we established domestic assault response teams who are victim-focused and specifically trained to respond to domestic abuse calls. The city of Barcelona, another CHANGE city, conducts gender impact analysis in urban planning to ensure that public spaces are safe for women and girls. The mayor of London recognized that women's risk of violence is heightened at night, so he created the Women's Night Safety Charter to encourage businesses to do their part to keep women safe when traveling, working, or going out at night. These are the types of innovative initiatives that are why we started CHANGE, so cities can share and learn from one another and surface new ways to advance equity. When cities take the initiative to protect women and girls from violence, everyone benefits. Communities are made safer for all, families are healthier, and economies are stronger. We still have a long, long way to go, but I'm encouraged by the progress I see happening in cities all over the world. Ending gender-based violence will require all of us to challenge our own behavior, social norms, and our systems. To those watching today, I encourage you to get involved at the local level. Ask your local leaders. Are we modeling a culture that normalizes or legitimizes violence? How are we deploying our resources to prevent and respond to gender-based violence? Get involved where you are and see what's possible to make change everywhere. Thank you again. I'm looking forward to an inspiring discussion, and over to you, Elizabeth.
Many thanks to you, to the Deputy Mayor, for her remarks today. I think she did a good job in setting the scene for our discussion. So I'm Elizabeth Cafferty, and it is my great honor and pleasure to be moderating this conversation with very distinguished speakers on International Women's Day. And I need to thank the Consulate Generals of Ireland and Mexico, and of course, again, the Mayor's Office of Los Angeles for inviting me to participate today. So who are our speakers this afternoon, this morning, wherever you're calling in from? First, we're going to hear from the Los Angeles Consul General of Mexico, Marcelo Solorio. Then we're going to hear from Anya Hearns, the Director of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs in the Conflict Resolution Unit. Then we're going to hear from Daglan O'Brien, who's Principal Officer in Ireland's Department of Justice, followed by Dulce Collin, the General Coordinator for Equality and Attention to Gender-Based Violence for the Government of Mexico City, who's also going to be again chairing the Change Initiative that the Deputy Mayor referenced already. And then finally, we're going to hear from the Los Angeles Consul General of Ireland, another Marcella Smythe, who will close the meeting. So, as you heard from the Deputy Mayor, gender-based violence affects women and girls all over the world. And the rates at which they experience gender-based violence, or GBV, increases during conflict and crisis. Violence against women and girls can also actually be a harbinger of conflict and civil unrest, which is why it's a component of the UN Security Council's Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Ireland and Mexico know this very well. They currently sit on the Security Council and are outspoken champions of gender equality and women, peace, and security, constantly working to ensure that women's rights, including actions to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, are placed front and center of the negotiations and the deliberations that the Security Council takes. Ireland, like Mexico, and also like the United States, have national action plans on UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So that's the resolution that established women, peace, and security as an area of work for the Council. And that was back in 2000. So 20 years, we've made some progress. We have much more to go. These national action plans detail how countries are going to implement the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, not just through their work at the Security Council, but domestically, and also include actions to take against sexual and gender-based violence. So it runs the whole gamut from women's participation in peace processes to addressing violence against women. So this agenda that started with the Security Council is not just implemented by the UN, but by individual governments through their diplomatic efforts, as we'll hear, but also, as I just mentioned, in each country at national and local levels. And this work is complemented and enhanced through the actions of civil society organizations, city governments, local government initiatives, including So Change, which I mentioned earlier, which is the City Hub and Network for Gender Equity. And at the moment, Los Angeles Mayor Garcetti chairs this, and then you'll be hearing how Mexico City is going to take over. So today, each of our speakers is going to talk about some of the real challenges as well as opportunities that they face in this work. What I'm looking forward to is not just hearing about how we're working at this on the sort of theoretical level, but we're going to get to listen to actual examples and also the challenges that all of us grapple with, because there are no easy answers here. So I'm going to start by turning to the Consul General of Mexico, Marcelo Solorio. Ms. Solorio, Mexico is working to take a comprehensive approach to battling gender-based violence. While this is an issue globally, at the national and local levels, it obviously manifests differently. And so you need to work on tailored prevention and response efforts, depending on your country and its situation. So can you share with us how Mexico is tackling this issue domestically, and perhaps talk about a little about how it changed during the pandemic, since we know when we just heard that violence against women and girls escalated. So I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you for giving us the context. We're very happy and very proud to work side by side with Ireland in this issue within the framework of the United Nations. And now, answering your question, I think that I have to address it from my point of view. I am an attorney and I am a diplomat, And I cannot let it pass to talk about the importance of case law as a deterrent of GBV. In September 2021, the Mexican Supreme Court of Justice ruled that a local provision penalizing the abortion was unconstitutional, making it clear that laws that have absolute prohibitions in the matter of abortion are not admissible under the scope of human rights. This measure, although related to a local law, has had a huge impact on a national scale, as the dictum must be observed in all courts of all levels. I think this is a fantastic determination from our justice system, because they are respecting the decision of women to decide on her own body. Also, I want to remind you, if you are, or share with you if you're not aware of this, but Mexico is the first country in whole Latin America to adopt the feminist foreign policy. So one of the components of a change aimed to erode the gap that prevents women to fully exercise their rights definitely has to do with women in decision-making positions. And allow me to use my personal as an example. I have the privilege to serve my country as Consul General in Los Angeles. However, in 135 years, I am the second one to serve in this position. Fortunately, in this administration, more women were recognized and now are being appointed as head of missions. For example, my colleagues in Santa Ana, Fresno, San Francisco, San Bernardino, Sacramento, and in these huge consul generals in Chicago and Houston. And for the very first time, we have a woman that had the position of ambassador to the United States.
Thanks so much. I mean, there's so much you've already said, which is incredibly interesting, right? The importance of having a legal structure and laws that support women and that show perpetrators they're not going to have immunity, respect for women's rights within the law, and actually having that implemented. Your own personal experience being a woman in a male-dominated field and the importance of getting to gender parity, particularly in policymaking roles. When you have a more diverse group of people, we know that they make better decisions and that you're able to help take decisions that reflect the reality of women's rights. So you've given me lots of questions that I could ask. I'm going to stick with one, which I found super interesting when I learned that your consular system actually has created what sounds to me like a really good practice mechanism to address domestic violence. And when we think of consular services, we don't necessarily think that that's someone that we would reach out to if we were experiencing domestic violence. But could you talk a little bit about that piece of work, perhaps how you undertake it in LA, and what sort of challenges you've seen around it, as well as sort of benefits that you've seen come out of that piece?
Yes, for sure. And it's interesting that we're talking about laws, but the important thing here is to really make it happen. And I am very proud that at the 50 consulates that we have in the United States, we have a special office that we call Ventanilla de Atención a la Mujer, which we just not address the issue of gender violence and help all these women that come here to require of our assistance, but we provide also orientation for mental health assistance. We also provide them with finance orientation. We also provide them with the tools to really become an empowered person. Sometimes when they are victims of violence, they don't know what they're worth. So we help them with all this process to denounce, with all the legal framework, with all the legal tools that we have, so they can denounce and they can protect their children if they have them, or protect themselves, of course. And then they can become entrepreneurs. We have a lot of cases, and then they can become, counselors of other women. So this is a fantastic project initiative that we have. We have been helping a lot of women. So I like to talk about, that we really make it happen. That's the important thing.
I love that. And I'm hoping that lots of people who just heard you explain that program will take that back. And I think lots of other consulates could learn from you. So we'll come back to you later with more questions for sure. I'm going to turn to Anya now. And I'm going to ask her to take us back to the global level. So people just heard me talk about the Security Council and what they do in this arena. But I bet you that many of them are very skeptical that the Security Council actually takes time out from discussing the things that we typically think of as its work, so sanctions or genocide, to actually discuss, women's political participation and gender-based violence, and how that works. And certainly we could all guess that there's some council members who would not like to have those conversations. But in the past, I guess, year and a half since Ireland has joined the council, it's really gotten a reputation as being a champion on this issue. So could you talk a little bit about what the Irish government's priorities are within this agenda, and obviously in relation to gender-based violence, and maybe an example of, how that, works, what you do to help make sure that your colleagues at the UN, at the Security Council, can help champion this issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Law Idir Náisiúnta na Mon Sanadív Galer. I'd like to wish you all a very happy International Women's Day, to those that are participating and listening in today. It's a very valid question, and I'd like to sort of start by sort of pushing it back a little bit to say, our aim at the Security Council is to ensure that the WPS, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, is mainstreamed right across the Council, that they're not just taking time out to talk about one particular aspect. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 is based around the pillars of, promotion, protection, participation. So if you look at those pillars will, in our view, are appropriate to all conversations across the Security Council. So what we've been doing since we joined the Council, and indeed during our Security Council campaign, was highlighting in advance how we wanted to mainstream the Women, Peace and Security agendas right across all of the Council products. And as you rightly say, both Ireland and indeed our colleagues from Mexico are seen as leading voices on the WPS agenda at the Security Council. Because of course, together with Mexico, we co-chair the informal expert group on women, peace and security, which brings together Security Council experts at the working level to facilitate a more systematic approach to WPS within the Council's own work, and it enables greater oversight and coordination of the implementation efforts. And if I can just explain this a little bit, like if there is a country debate coming up on the Council on Haiti, Myanmar, let's say Ethiopia, Somalia, what happens here is that as co-chairs of the IEG, we bring together, the NGO working group there. We look at the experts, we get the UN's perhaps resident coordinator or senior UN officials to join to give a briefing on what's going on in that country. And at that particular time, we look at then seeing how is the WPS agenda impacted in that country. And perhaps also for mandates for peacekeeping renewals as well, to see how can we improve the lot of the WPS agenda for women in those countries as well, and how can we make the UN, step up to its responsibilities under the resolution also. So it's extremely important, the work of the IEG, and it's great to be working with Mexico. We're both singing off the one hymn sheet on this, and very closely working together in ensuring that the WPS agenda is not just spoken about individually at the Council, but rather mainstreamed right across the products as well. And another initiative that we undertook during our presidency back in 2021 was, along with Mexico and Kenya, we formed what was known as a WPS presidency trio. And again, this is where we all committed to using our respective council presidencies to integrate WPS fully into all discussions at the council and to mainstream WPS across all the thematic and country files during our presidency. And this initiative, I'm happy to say, has been carried forward by Niger, Norway, the United Arab Emirates, who currently have the presidency of the Security Council, and Albania, which is a new member this year, which will be coming up later in the year as well. So we're hoping by starting off with what was a trio that, you know, it will be continued by most presidencies, and again it will help to greater highlight WPS initiatives in all, as I say, all these important council products and statements that are coming out. Also during our presidency, a new record was set at the council, with 16 of 17 civil society briefers coming to the council being women. And again, this is really important, bringing briefers to the council. Now, of course, during COVID, you know, we were doing this virtually, and of course you also have to be very careful when bringing briefers to the council from a country that's in conflict, that we operate on the principle of do no harm for those briefers as well, because sometimes they may not be able to return to their country for some of what they talk about at the council as well. So, but we set this new record, and I think also setting the principle that the Security Council needs to hear the actual voices of women and men who are affected by conflict in those countries and what it is that it needs to do. So I think this is a clear and tangible way of including through strengthening also the language in council products, such as, say, the peacekeeping mandates, the various resolutions coming through, and of course the all-important presidential statements which come out on individual countries. If I can just give you an example on the peacekeeping mandates, there are two specific. One is MONUSCO and the other is MINUSMA. And in both of those resolutions,
And I'm going to make
mandates,
you tell people what they are.
I beg your pardon. Yes, of course. These are the peacekeeping mandates for UN peacekeeping forces, which are operating in Mali, is MINUSMA, and MONUSCO is in Congo. So every year these come up for renewal, and then we look at these resolutions to see what is, you know, what's happening, and we look at them very, very closely from the women, peace and security aspects, and in particular, as you've mentioned, gender-based violence, and more importantly, sexual and conflict-related violence, and ensuring that these issues are raised in the mandates themselves, but also that provisions are put in for survivors of CRSV, as we call it, conflict-related sexual violence. And in 2021, we managed to make changes in the language, which ensures that, you know, provisions of psychosocial services for people who are suffering, survivors who are suffering from trauma, and sexual and reproductive health services are also part of these mandates. So that's just a practical example of an increased and strengthened language in it. We would like to do more, and sometimes on the mandates, just to say that some of these are technically rolled over. So where a mandate is being technically rolled over, which means there isn't a debate, it's not opened up, then we don't have that opportunity to open up the resolution to have a look at the language. That's just to give you a practical example of where we're doing that with our colleagues as well. So I can leave it at that if you like, and come back on any questions, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you. You stole some of my follow-up questions there, but I think that was really very comprehensive, and I guess a sort of like 101 or more than a 101 for those who aren't used to Security Council speak. But you know, having worked on many a Security Council resolution myself, I just want to emphasize to everyone that what Mexico and Ireland have achieved, that you've just heard a little bit about, it's no small feat at all, to either get women invited to speak to the council, so the civil society speakers that were mentioned, or to get additional language to make sure that a UN country team, mission, or a government in which the UN has a mission has been asked to address conflict-related sexual violence or violence against women in general as part of its work. So now I'm going to move along, and now we're finally going to come to Daglan O'Reen, who has been patiently waiting to speak. So you're working on the development of Ireland's latest national strategy on domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence. Increasing number of countries now have these strategies, but lots of times they're just written by civil servants in sort of consultation with each other, or just a few civil society organizations. Ireland takes a different tack, and it's holding a public consultation to inform its next strategy, which, from having also worked in civil society, is, I hear that and I think, well, that again is incredibly good practice. This is a best practice example. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about why going through such a process like that is important to Ireland, how it shapes the strategy, and sort of overall, if you could tell us about how the Department of Justice approaches this work.
Thank you. And I'm just delighted and want to thank my colleagues in the Consul General for the opportunity to be part of the event on International Women's Day. Absolutely, we didn't go about preparing the next national strategy, which would be number 3 in the series, on the basis of a small group of civil servants or sort of superficial consultation with NGOs. We took a radically different approach. We tried to create a genuine partnership with frontline services and organisations that work with victims. In our system, women's refuges and rape crisis centres are NGOs supported with public funding, but the services grew up organically over many years and commenced long before government took responsibility and saw the work that they do as a really important public service. And some of that is still manifested in terms of some of the issues that we have to address. We don't have uniform provision of women's refuges and sheltered accommodation throughout the state, and that's something we need to tackle. But it does mean that we have a network of local groups who are providing the services, are working very closely with victims, and can bring their practice wisdom, if I can call it that, to bear on the development of the next national strategy. So we consciously adopted the principle of co-design, that we would work together and collaborate on developing the strategy. Co-design isn't co-decision making. Government has to make decisions about allocation of resources and how the public administration is designed and organised. And NGOs have a public facing role, which includes critiquing government policy. So occasional tensions and different roles, but we managed to work together respecting that. And it was a very positive experience. We approached it on the basis of solving problems together and tried to make sure there was genuine collaboration in developing the text. So there's a lot of consultation and specialist events and regional seminars and so on, involving the NGOs who provide the frontline services. We partnered with 2 specific NGOs in the development of the strategy. One is the National Women's Council of Ireland, so that title, I guess, is self-explanatory. The other is Safe Ireland, which is the NGO that acts as an umbrella body for the local women's refuges. So the strategy was developed in a partnership between those 3 organisations, 2 NGOs, and our department in the Department of Justice. Previous strategies have been critiqued as being developed on a business planning basis. So government departments and agencies will look at what they're currently doing, look at what they plan to do next year, and that becomes the strategy. We decided also to take a more strategic approach and looked at the type of transformation we want for Irish society and what the issues are and what resources would be required to address those issues. So the draft strategy, which I said was developed very much sort of on a team basis with the NGOs in consultation with local NGOs, sets out a series of high-level objectives and actions that have been developed in negotiation with the sector and also, of course, in negotiation with government departments and agencies that will have implementation responsibilities. We have a draft. We've recently launched a consultation process on that draft. Part of that is a questionnaire for the general public, to give the general public an opportunity to comment. So we move outside those of us who are professionally involved in the area. But we're also going back with the draft to the NGOs that were part of the first round of consultation. A real test of consultation is that one can see where one had an impact. Look at the text and say, this is what I said and this is how they have responded to it. So that's the value and that's the reason for going back out with the draft. This final consultation round will end next Thursday, and then we move on to review the text, see if we've missed anything that's important, and we also move on to develop the first annual implementation plan. We'll be halfway through the year before we have that implementation plan. So it'll cover the remainder of this year and next year. It'll be an 18-month implementation plan. So we balance having really ambitious objectives, high-level objectives, the vision for Irish society with a practical implementation plan for the remainder of this year and for next year, and so on. The strategy will last for 5 years. It'll be a living document, it'll be midterm review, and so on. And as actions are completed, they will be replaced with the next follow-on action.
Again, there's a lot in there that I could follow up on. Thank you so much for laying that out. I think one question that I'm going to ask is something we haven't touched on yet today, but your remarks bring it to mind that this is, we talked about a sort of criminal justice and legal system reforms and, using the courts, but this really is, at its core, this is about culture, right? Attitudes, what's accepted by society. So in terms of your work in this strategy, what have you been doing to address this? And, particularly in relation to men and boys, how is Ireland working to sort of challenge the attitudes and the behaviors that, allow this to continue? And what have you been doing? What have you found that sort of works to help overcome these challenges? And of course, I've just asked you a massive question, and I'm going to warn you that you just have a couple of minutes to respond to it. So maybe just some sort of preliminary thoughts, and then we, of course, could return to this later. Thanks.
And the actions in the strategy are organised in line with the 4 pillars in the Istanbul Convention. So the one that your question focuses in on is the prevention pillar. And that really is about changing attitudes in society, and in particular, changing the attitudes of men and boys. And maybe 2 dimensions to that. One is it making it clear that violence is not acceptable. And the second also is empowering men and boys not to be passive bystanders when they see things that are not appropriate. We had a high-profile rape case in Northern Ireland some years ago. It's a different legal system, but culturally quite similar to us. And the Northern Ireland authorities carried out a review of their criminal justice system and how it deals and supports or doesn't victims of sexual assault. And we carried out a similar review in this jurisdiction, led by a man called Tom O'Malley, and left us with some 50 recommendations. And they cover much of the same ground. You mentioned reforming the criminal justice system and supporting victims in the criminal trial process. That's part of what we're doing. But awareness and training, awareness campaigns for the general public, including within that specifically focused on men, and training for a full range of public service staff, including the police, are things that we're also addressing. The strategy will take that forward, and in particular, we are looking at what we can do within the education system, starting even at the primary level, long before boys and girls realise that there's a difference and an attraction that develops in the teenage years, when they're still friends, talking about what respect means, and then moving on to the secondary level, looking at what consent means, and also in third level, both in terms of making third level safe for students, but also dealing with sexual harassment in terms of faculties and staff. So yes, this is a really important issue. It's a very challenging and ambitious target we're setting for ourselves to try and bring about the change in attitudes and change in society that's needed. And we're not naive enough to think that that task will ever be completed. It needs continuous attention. Every new generation of boys that grows up and girls need to understand what is acceptable in a relationship and what respect for another person means, what consent means.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've hit on so many sort of important points there. About how, the education points alone and this idea of respect, and you can't just start, doing public health awareness campaigns at our age, to be honest. It has to start with, children in school and, rethinking what's acceptable and what's not. Dulce, you've been really patient. I'm going to start asking you a question in 1 second, but I want to also alert everyone who's watching and just remind them that we're going to open to Q&A very soon. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, please do. I think there's lots of different issues we could dig in deeper on. I certainly have many questions I could ask, but it would be great if we had some coming from the audience. I would love to take some of those. So Dilji, again, thank you so much for joining us today as you're the General Coordinator for Equality and Attention to Gender Violence for the Government of Mexico City. Mexico City, as we've said, is Change's new chair and has been a leader amongst global cities working to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. So this is a global network that you're going to begin chairing. Everyone from Barcelona, Mexico City is members of it. Can you share with us what you now see as, or what you believe the network's priorities should be? And I'm going to guess that that is going to include addressing sort of the elevated incidence of gender-based violence that we've seen due to COVID. And even though some cities are arguably coming out of COVID, we now, of course, have sort of very worrying global economic trends. Many of us are experiencing inflation. There are sanctions that are happening, sort of ramping up every day, which also is going to increase the sort of pressure on the economies of most countries. So these are all triggers that I'm highlighting, which are going to, increase GBV only more than it is now. So you really have your work cut out for you. So if you can share with us how you're going to approach this and what differences change can make. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And first of all, thank you for having me here today on International Women's Day. We have a very busy agenda in Mexico City due to the activities for this commemoration, but I'm very glad I've got to be here with you all. And well, yes, as we all know, local governments have an impact on the lives of people, a very great impact on the lives of people in shaping how people experience public services and public spaces. And understanding not only that men and women have different experiences, but how and why is central in the way we as a local government design and create public policies, making our cities more equal, more just and sustainable for everyone. So that is why in 2020, Barcelona, Freetown, London, Los Angeles, Tokyo, and Mexico City launched the City Hub and Network for Gender Equity, and we call it Change, as an effort to collectively advance gender equality in our cities, in our operations, our outreach, services, programs, and every other initiative. And Change main goal is to promote further progress on gender equality. We understand that we have come along since the past century, but we have still faced many challenges in our cities and in our communities, from poverty to economic inequality to crime to racism to climate change and many other problems that we face today. And of course, gender-based violence is one of the greatest challenges of our times. So we have been working on, as a city's hub, on some initiatives that we hope we can inspire other cities to create policies for gender equality, because gender-based violence and gender equality are intersect. We cannot have society without violence when we, as long as we don't have or achieve gender equity.
Thanks so much for sort of setting the stage for us and explaining, some of the challenges that you have in front of you and how you're going to approach them. I'm going to follow up and ask, you personally have so much experience working on this issue, and you're grounded in Mexico City. So can you share with us what have you learned? What has Mexico City done that might be useful, that you'd like to see replicated in other cities, that you're going to try to use your position to help share that, good experience with others?
Well, as I said, violence against women and girls is the greatest challenge we face today in our country and in Mexico City. And although we have strong policies to prevent and eradicate gender-based violence, we have protection services for victims and a large corpus of laws and advanced legislation that aim to protect human rights for women and girls, including the right to live a life without violence. We are still facing alarming numbers of crimes that go from street harassment to rapes to feminicides. That is why in Mexico City's mayor, Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, issued a gender violence alert for the city on November 2019. With this gender violence alert, she activated a series of measures, 11 urgent measures to be exact, to address violence against women. This gender violence alert is a mechanism that it's a national mechanism that we activated locally. And these measures go from new legislations. For example, we have a reform that in which the aggressor is the one that must leave the house and not the woman in the context of domestic violence, because we have shelters for women that are victims of domestic violence. But we questioned that. We thought, why does the woman have to leave the house if the aggressor is a man that is committing violence? So we passed that legislation. Other measures cover other issues. For example, we created new services. We created a genetic laboratory for forensic purposes to have better tools to pursue crimes, sexual crimes, and feminicides. We created a program of women lawyers in every station to advise women in the process of making a complaint or denounce a crime, so they are not victimized again by police or by public servants. And we also created a huge program to make public spaces and transport safe for women and girls, among other initiatives. So this alert, this gender violence alert, it's a protection mechanism for the human rights of women that we believe is unique in the world. And we have, in 2 years, we have promising results. For example, we have seen a reduction of 22% of violent deaths of women, which include feminicides and homicides, because in Mexico City, every violent homicide of women, any violent death of women, it's investigated as feminicide, because we believe in the gender perspective of these crimes. And also we have seen an increase of 37% of prosecutions of aggressors. So we are also tackling impunity, that it's a great problem in Mexico. So yeah, we think that this mechanism is we have seen some results, but also we know that we have a long way to go. As you said a moment ago, culture transformation is needed. It's urgent. We need to change roles that perpetuate inequality between men and women. We need to disrupt the unbalanced relations of power between men and women in public and domestic dimensions of life. And we need the media, companies, and other actors to be accountable of this in this process in this cultural transformation. And also we need men taking responsibility for their role in a more equal and just society. So we as a government we are doing our part, we are doing our obligations, but we need all the society to take a step in this process, in this transformation, so we can achieve more justice and more equal world for women and girls.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think those are sort of really interesting examples, and it's heartening to see that you have made progress in some areas. I mean, the prosecutions is so interesting because I think everywhere, you know, there's such a challenge. There's a challenge in meeting the bar, what you need to see to be able to bring forward a prosecution. Also, lots of women, of course, don't want to press charges in these sort of issues because, you know, we know that in terms of protecting women, we have a very long way to go. Certainly in the United States, you can go and try to get protection orders. It's extremely difficult to get a protection order. B, if you actually get it, that certainly doesn't mean that you have a police officer outside your home 24/7 to keep you and your children, you know, because these are often women that have children, partners of men, to keep you safe. And so we still see these very high levels of domestic violence turning fatal in many cases. One thing you picked up on, you mentioned that we have not really discussed so far is the media and their portrayals of women. So everything from, if we think about sort of, you know, international, you know, movies that make the rounds, television shows that are seen in more places, but also how, you know, how journalists write about issues and how they portray women, whether it's in a sort of specific case like we've been talking about, or just in general about going back to Anya's points about keeping women parliamentarians safe, right? How women parliamentarians, women in all public offices who, you know, have public profiles, how they're described and how their actions and decisions and words are spoken about. And we all know that usually women are portrayed one way and men are portrayed another. Dolce, do you want to sort of speak a little bit to this about how to engage with media and journalists to try and change the narrative? And I'm going to put you on the spot initially, but I do want to open that up to everyone because you probably all have experiences about how to try to address this issue from a sort of communication standpoint.
Thank you. It's a complex issue because we are a liberal democracy and we protect the free speech in the media. But also we've seen in the country very interesting initiatives that comes from the women that work in the media that are promoting a more equal and a more just way to portray women and men in journalism, but also in television, in movies, and yeah, we've seen this trend. It's a global trend. In Mexico, I think we are making progress, but yeah, it's still we still face some changes in this area, but let's see. I think that media as a company, yes, as a private company, must address this issue. And yes, I believe they have to be accountable in their responsibility to perpetuate this inequality.
Marcela, do you want to sort of jump in?
Well, you know, I have been listening to you all, and when you talk about the United Nations sometimes and all the efforts that we have been doing there, and you try to explain AIN and all the efforts and the different Declan and Dulce have talked about, And sometimes it's very hard to understand really how we can land or make concrete advances in this. So I would like to share something that for me is very important, and for Mexico and the United States and Canada. We have the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in this agreement, for the very first time, we have the gender perspective. So I will ask you, all of you, because it's very nice when you have that in the, written and in the agreement. And it's very nice that you have this gender perspective, and it's so modern and it's so 21st century. But then at the consulate, you can see the indigenous people come here, they're beaten, or they're afraid of being, murdered by their partner, their intimate partner. So yes, we have this gender vision, but how can we really, we say in Spanish, darle dientes, like to really give the sanctions to Mexico, to the United States and Canada, to really comply with this vision. So that's for me the challenge, because we can, of course, all these frameworks and all the efforts that we have been doing are fantastic, and we have to keep on doing that, but we have to be more creative, and also countries have to be more committed to really not just have the vision, but if someone is not doing it or someone is not complying with it, how are going to enforce it? And that's my attorney's point of view speaking.
No, I mean, thank you so much. And I think that actually did sort of link, because you're both talking about like implementation. How do we get from, I mean, we have to, if we don't have structures in place, right? And this is, you would say particularly, I guess, with your lawyer's hat on, you need legal frameworks in place. But then once they're there, they can't just sit on the shelf. Like, how do we move forward? And I think that is a good question for our other two speakers. Do either of you want to jump in here and talk about how you translate either, we talked about Ireland's GBV strategy, how you make that jump from ensuring now that you've got it in place to implementation? You spoke a little, but you might want to add something. Or Anya, when we talk about, and I was complimenting the sort of progress that you were able to get through in terms of the Security Council and increasing the UN's mandate, expanding it to include gender-based violence. So what happens? What happens once, we have these things in place? Could you give perhaps an example of how you follow up on implementation, or the cost? And I think that Marcelo is saying, what's the cost when people don't implement things? Are there what tools can we use? What sticks do we have?
You want me to go, or on your first?
Yeah, Declan, I might get you to do the national perspective first, and then I can come in on the international perspective and see where we can relate the two under the NAP. Thanks.
Yeah. And Dulce referred to liberal democracies, and the Club of Liberal Democracies that pursue peace and prosperity for their citizens are in one category. And you might even put more authoritarian systems in that category as well. But I think, as Marcella said, from a legal perspective, there are real issues with more aggressive countries and wars of conquest. And that's part of the current of today's context that doesn't fill one with a huge amount of hope. In terms of the national context in Ireland, we have really strong political leadership, and that's a function of the number of women who are in key leadership positions, including that our Minister for Justice is a woman. And we also have this spirit of partnership working with the NGOs, so that civil servants are willing to listen and to work with people who have frontline experience and are managing the services that I referred to earlier. But I think one of the things I just want to mention in terms of implementation is a willingness to reform our system of public administration. One of the criticisms heretofore is that there has been a dispersed responsibility, and responsibility for policy being vested in the Department of Justice, and responsibility for funding of frontline services, refuges and rape crisis centres being invested in a different department that has a focus on equality and on children. So the government has, in principle, decided, and this will be confirmed when the final strategy goes to government has, in principle, decided to consolidate that responsibility within the Department of Justice. There's a bit of work to be done in terms of how we're going to manage that, but it does look like that we will be putting in place a standalone, dedicated DSGVB agency with responsibility for policy coordination, so coordinating all the other departments and agencies, with responsibility for running the awareness and training campaigns that I mentioned, and also with responsibility for funding and developing the frontline services and having a national plan in place to make sure a specific target we're setting ourselves, for example, is to make sure that there is sheltered accommodation, women's refuge, within a 30-minute drive of each part of the state, or most of the state. The challenge of servicing sparsely populated rural areas, but in terms of the bulk of the population living in urban areas, that's the objective. So putting practical things in place, putting a standalone agency whose job it is to tackle domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and to develop the services, and to make sure we have whole of government coordination, and to run the training and awareness campaigns as part of our response.
Thanks very much indeed, Daglon. And just to complement that as well, Elizabeth, Ireland has on its third National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. It's unique in that it has both a domestic and an international element of that plan. And as Daglon has mentioned there, the move towards the new DSGVV strategy and the way that they're looking at that. And interestingly, when the last plan was launched back in 2019, at that time, the Department of Justice also had equality. So we had a change of government, we had a change of departments, and some, as he's mentioned there, policy and funding shifted in between two departments, which of course is a challenge. But I would just like to say that in our National Action Plan, we have a monitoring framework. And under that framework, we have specific activities, and actions which have to be carried out both domestically by various departments that have responsibilities, including around GBV as well, and also then internationally for the Department of Foreign Affairs. In relation to issues. And just maybe to give an example would be if we were looking at sanctions, and as we know, sanctions at the moment are something which is on the global agenda in relation to Ukraine. Like again, looking at, just to give you an idea on the protection on sanctions, it's to increase advocacy to ensure protection mechanisms and services are properly funded and prioritised globally. So part of our actions there is to advocate for greater reference to the conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence across thematic activities and country-specific activities as a criterion for UN sanctions, and advocate for accountability for the use of conflict-related SGBV at all levels. And then you have, how do we measure that in reporting? So that's just one sort of example at the international level where you look at where we're dealing with something and ensuring that, the WPS agenda is not left out in relation to it. But I'd also like to kind of come back as well to that media issue. One of the things that we found when we were reviewing our national action plans was the fact that, we weren't doing enough community outreach on what the plan is all about. And, we've consistently said, and I think Dolce said it there, gender equality and gender-based violence are interlinked to a certain extent, and it's about the education system. And Daglon in his first presentation mentioned about, what's coming up in this new strategy around, education and cultural education, starting not just when they get to be teenagers, but, and then the other issue too is, while Elizabeth, you said, well, in some respects, there's no point trying to teach us, but at the same point in time, we do need to teach adults because they're the parents of children, and children have learned, attitudes as well, sometimes coming from family situations. So it is right across the board. So it's really important, I think, that you get the message across through social media and whatever channels you can, that, gender-based violence is wrong, number one, okay, fine. But number two, that you make sure that people are being educated through the social media systems. And Dulce made the point, like, you know, liberal democracy and freedom of the press and all of that. And I wouldn't suggest in any shape or form that we go against that, but I think there are ways to put this across and to maybe run campaigns in relation to it as well. And we've ideal opportunities around, say, International Women's Day. We also have WPS month, you know, and again, getting that out there and getting it into our school system as well, I think is extremely important. It's not going to solve everything, but we have to start somewhere. And I think, you know, certainly with the new strategy coming aboard, it's great to see that the education side is there, because in our national action plan, it's not just, say, the Department of Justice or the department that has responsibility for equality that has, you know, indicators and activities. It's also our health services, you know, it's our education system as well. So it's about having a joined up approach nationally and internationally, and again, internationally, ensuring that women's full, equal and meaningful participation at all levels, be it at the start of peace talks, be it at the implementation of peace deals, you know, all of that, it just needs to be joined up and have a more effective approach as well. But I think it's also a learning process for all of us as well, and seeing how we can take it forward. But I'll leave it there. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. And I certainly didn't mean to be glib when I was saying you shouldn't, and didn't mean to infer that we shouldn't be targeted. But you know, the importance of beginning when children are young, and actually there, you know, when I was at the UN Secretariat, there was a very senior official who joined, and when he started, he and I had to start briefing him as a gender advisor. He was very clear that he did not have any background, didn't know what he was supposed to do on this issue. But from the beginning, he asked lots of questions. Whenever he went out to the field, he made sure that he was meeting with not just women leaders, but with women's groups. And sort of, you know, as we moved along, he started to more proactively request analysis and updates. And it was one of sort, as you can, you know, hear from my little story, that it was such a gratifying experience working with him, because here was someone who, you know, was a diplomat his whole life, and came to this wanting to learn, wanting to get better, and really becoming an advocate. So it is possible. And we need to keep doing that. So we've had a bunch of questions now from our audience. I'm going to sort of collect and summarize them, because a number of them really focus on questions. They want to learn more about the sort of drivers and how we can address the drivers of GBV. And so when I say that, people have asked about what role poverty plays, income inequality, migration, also, again, culture more generally, and questions about, you know, are there some issues specific, because we talked about how there needs to be a cultural context in all of our work and when designing sort of interventions, both in terms of prevention and response. Is there something specific in Ireland or in Mexico, some specific cultural issues that you have been involved with addressing, what specific actions you may have taken? So I don't know who wants to jump in to start replying. I mean, I think these are all incredibly important, and some of the sort of key drivers. And, you know, Marcella did mention before that in terms of response, they're working on the sort of, you know, economic empowerment of women, as because that is, you know, what was implied in her comments was that is part of what makes some of these women, and I think you were talking about migrants and also Indigenous women as well, particularly vulnerable. So who wants to sort of take a crack at answering, again, another sort of very big question?
If you want, I can just add very quickly that for us is a real challenge, because when you migrate also with your culture and your customs, and here at the States, even though they're here in the more, if you can say, open culture, the clash is very challenging for all these people, but also within their in the domestic arena, because, you know, now we are witnessing, and I know this is the International Day for Women, but we are seeing that violence is not it's an issue that it doesn't differentiate if it is a woman or a man. And we are seeing more and more men that are victims of violence. So I think, someone mentioned before about culture and information and education. And so for me, that's a big, big issue and challenge.
Yeah, I suppose violence is at the key, and lack of respect and power imbalances, and not really in our system social class issues. That violence against women is found in working class communities, in more marginalized communities, but also in middle class communities. There are specific cultural issues in terms of groups migrating from a different culture that need to be addressed in terms of education and awareness and so on, and making newcomers. And Ireland, I'm boasting on this, Ireland has done very well in accommodating people who've come to us. When I was a young man, Ireland was a country that exported our population to the United States and to other countries. We now have 17% of our population born outside of the state. And most of those, 12%, from not an Irish background. And we have managed that transition and welcomed people from different communities quite successfully. So there are cultural issues, but we need to be careful about not pointing finger or stigmatizing migrant groups and so on. This is primarily an issue, I have to say, for men listening, of male sense of entitlement and power, inability to articulate, inability to control emotions, to manage tensions in a relationship, and at the root of it, it's violence. Women are generally weaker and smaller than men, so and in an intimate relationship, that's part of the dynamic. But the one thing I would say, again, on the basis of the advice we have from the police, that there are certain types of violence that are more visible in poorer communities and in migrant communities and so on, but it's not really a social class issue. It's as common, perhaps more hidden, in better off, more middle class communities, and linked into economic dependency of women on men still.
And if I give me 30 seconds, Anya, before I turn to you, because I want to make sure that I didn't misrepresent that question or the migration issue. Although there's certainly a lot has been written about what you just said, Declan, but I think they were trying to say that when you are a migrant, I think the journey, you become very vulnerable, right? And so I've been working a lot with Afghan refugees, and there is a community that are in third countries right now waiting to move along. They are in whether you're in sort of a refugee camp or you're in a more urban environment, you inherently become more vulnerable. And, to your point about sort of thinking about men's behaviors, the men there are under incredible stress. And so they're more likely to start perpetrating. The women there are more vulnerable because they don't have their regular social networks and social systems and family structures around them. And so I think there's and trafficking, right? That's a type of, I hate to call it type of migration, but it is sort of that movement also makes women and girls more vulnerable. So I think it was, that was how they were thinking about it. Anya, I'm sorry, go on to you.
Yeah. No problem, Elizabeth, at all. Just on that, and to add to what Declan has said as well, when we were consulting on our third National Action Plan, we took an approach whereby we had 2 sessions with men and women from migrant communities who had come into Ireland, both as refugees and as economic migrants as well, to ensure that we were capturing, the issues for them that were really important. And again, you make a very valid point. If people are coming into Ireland as a refugee from a conflict zone, then they're bringing with them that trauma, and that trauma just doesn't stop with them. What we found is it filters down to the next generation and even the next generation after that. We found that we had a community of women and men from Congo who were 20 years in one county in Ireland. And when they came to the consultation processes with us, they were talking still about that trauma that was still being impacted down along. So it was really important for us to get their views. And there are actions in our National Action Plan then domestically as well as to how we address some of the issues around that, around the GBV, around the trauma, and to ensure that we're able to assist those women and men as well in relation to it. So I think it's a really very valid point. And we need to be given, as Daglon has said, we've had a huge increase in our population, which is non-Irish. I think it's really important that we try and address that as well. So I just wanted to put that forward today. Thanks, Elizabeth.
And if I could jump in again, in case I misunderstood the question, we also have issues in terms of human trafficking in Ireland, and unlike other EU member states, the primary driver is the trafficking of women for sexual exploitation. And that applies even in the case of EU citizens who wants to come to Ireland, have the right to work, the right of residence, and so on. So that's something we're aware of, the inherent vulnerability, particularly people coming from marginalized communities in the countries of origin in relation to human trafficking.
Thank you. And I've been maybe a mediocre moderator because we are technically out of time, but we have a final speaker who I am delighted to introduce now. So if you can just hang on for a few more minutes. So the Consul General of Ireland in Los Angeles, Marcella Smythe. We had two Marcellas today. We are one of the luckier International Women's Day groups. So I'm going to hand over to you to sort of make some wrap-up remarks and draw any conclusions you might want to.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to all of the panelists, not only for their time, but for their openness. I'm not sure if it's actually going to be possible to really wrap up what has been a really rich and deep discussion. And thanks also to our audience for their participation. I think the fact that so many have joined us today and demonstrated their eagerness to discuss this topic, it both underlines its importance and its urgency. You know, for Ireland, it really is of vital importance that we both consider and address the issue of gender-based violence in a truly holistic way. So that means examining and understanding that intersection between the international, national, and local contexts in which the issue both occurs and is addressed. And so what we've heard today, you know, the various contexts in which gender-based violence occurs, but what's very clear from all of the panelists is that while the context may vary, at the very core of violence against women, we see lies gender inequality and societal acceptance of violence against women. I think we've heard today as well about the policies and agendas at international level, of national policies and of local programs. And again, what this event, with this event, what we really wanted to do was to demonstrate how interdependent these levels are and how lessons and learnings must permeate and flow across those spheres. We've heard, from Nina today that 1 in 3 women globally experience gender-based violence. UN research reveals that in 2020, globally 81,000 women and girls were killed. Of those, 47,000 were killed by a partner or family member. That equates to a woman or girl in her home being killed every 11 minutes. Those statistics are horrifying. They are so incredibly stark. And what they really demonstrate is that gender-based violence is a global pandemic. And it stands to reason then that addressing this public health emergency demands that intersection of the global protection of international human rights. That means that women have the right to live lives free of violence, with national level legislation and policies that enact and enforce those rights, as Marcella and Daglon mentioned, that criminalize and prosecute those who commit violence, that promote equality, that provide resources for prevention and response, and that in turn act with local level intervention sites, promote understanding of respect and consent, provide locally supports and services. And importantly, as I think all of our panelists pointed out, the responses at all levels must listen and act on the voices and views of women. So this intersection, in this way, it provides for a comprehensive, holistic, coherent, and collective response. And that is the only way we can ensure women's lives are being made safer. I really do congratulate Los Angeles and Mexico City on recognizing and acting on that knowledge. And the progress that has been achieved already at the city level, as outlined by Dulce, it really is further evidence that this approach can work. And I wish Dulce and Mexico City the very best as they take on the role of chair now. And I hope as well that we'll have the opportunity to come back in this format again to learn more from you, Dulce, about what has worked, what lessons you have learned. I also really hope that this initiative that you've taken on, it can be broadened. I think as Nina mentioned, city leaders are uniquely placed in terms of their access to and influence in the community. So we have a saying in Irish, Niñarska Carla. That means there is no strength without unity. So coming together as a global community, as we have done today, participants from Dublin, from Mexico City, from Los Angeles, from New York, it's so important that we are coming together as a global community, both within and outside of international organizations. And I think therein lies the solution. As I said, I hope this is not the end of the conversation. I look forward to coming together again, where I hope at that stage we'll be signaling real progress. So thank you all so very much.